Hey, this is Eric from Volition Recording Studio. I decided to make this video because I feel like this is something that will be quite relevant or useful for those of you out there. Podcasts in general is actually on the rise now. So a lot of people are doing podcasts in general, and I'm not the exception as well. I'm actually having my podcast that will be launched, I hope, soon.
You die!
I hope it will be very helpful for those of you out there that wants to edit their own podcast episodes. So I assume that at this point that you're watching this video, you already have your podcast recorded. The next question is, let's just say you have very little experience with all this stuff in general. What's next is probably the question here. So when it comes to editing, I like making it easier for those of you watching, and even for myself. I love keeping things clean and simple when it comes to podcast editing. So I always make sure that no matter what I do, especially for podcast editing, I always want to make sure, first things first, that everything is on point and with the right timing, especially for voiceovers or like in a podcast scenario. It's kind of very annoying and it's just super obvious. It's not something you can disguise, unlike mixing, where some things you can actually kind of hide. But for audio, especially for voiceovers and podcasts, you really can't. So I always make sure that I align everything perfectly. And even when it comes to recording as well, I want to make sure that the latency is correct. So first things first, you always want to check if your audio is aligned first. I'll always make sure that is your number one priority. Don't worry about anything else right now. Load your audio into your DAW or whatever you're editing your audio with. Just take a listen to it. Make sure that, fast forward or choose a certain segment that you want to go to. Listen to it. Make sure there's no weird latency or audio latency. I'll let you do that first, and then we'll come back and talk about how I'll approach editing. All right, welcome back. So I hope you're able to check if your podcast audio is on time and in line, and hopefully everything is aligned so we don't have any more issues. When it comes to editing, I have kind of three major steps in mind. Kind of how I would edit my podcast episodes is starting with number one is I call it the trim phase. So this is very simple. Listen to your podcast and act more like a director and choose what's relevant to the podcast content and what is considered as, like, I call banter, or sometimes like unnecessary, I guess, segments, just because, a podcast can have either a very long duration or short duration, depending on what the content is about and what the podcast is about. So essentially, when we have a podcast, it's very normal to have a lot of banter in between a 2-hour podcast versus an hour, or like 10 or 15 minutes, which if you want a more concise type of podcast. So I have quite a few trimmed out sections. Like originally I had my podcast, the original recordings was roughly around, let's see here. I'm going to take a look here. So my podcast, I was able to filter it down to 54 minutes or so, roughly. The original podcast episode was actually running for 2 hours. For those of you that are new, if you don't know how to cut something, very simple. Go up, find your pair of scissors, click on it. And let's just say you don't want a section. You just cut it off here. Just say this is the part I don't want. And we just cut off wherever we want it to end. So in this case, if we want to cut out this, so now we have this to this is what we have selected, and we can just cut it out. So I always highly recommend that you start with the trim first. Go over the whole episode, listen to it, cut out some parts. Always start with that first. I'll say the only difference is if you're doing a video type of podcast, it is a little bit different because you are essentially the actor or the focus on screen. So this really mostly pertains to audio only versus video podcast, just because there is a little bit of a separation here. Even though essentially the audio is the same, how it's presented is still very different. Because like if you watch a video podcast, you're more going to pay attention to the podcasters versus the audio quality. Versus like if you're sitting there, maybe driving, maybe doing something, listening to audio, listening to a podcast audio only kind of format, then it'll be a little bit different. You're going to be more attentive to little mistakes. And so always starting number one, always try to trim out your stuff. Easy. All right, and number two, when it comes to editing, I call this the detailing. So after you cut out you condense your podcast episode down to a more consumable size. Next thing you always want to do is make sure it flows nicely. So sometimes I have podcast episodes where I'm editing something, or maybe you've come across this sometimes. Editing may not be as good. You may have some issues with maybe like a hop or a skip. Let's take this audio clip here for example. Let's just say, yeah, we cut it out and whatnot, but let's just say we have our audio a little bit unaligned from the original, right? So what that ends up happening is it kind of has a very weird, jarring experience. So especially when we're going from one part to another, we want to make sure it's not obvious if we have a cut. Because if we do have a cut, we want to make sure we kind of use smoke and mirrors to disguise those really weird, awkward cuts. Sometimes you do come across that when you do podcasting, especially if you do it long term enough or long enough. Sometimes when you're recording audio, there'll be a hop, a skip, or just some sort of sound you don't want in the podcast. Or you try to maybe cut out a certain section of a word and have audio play. So in this case, I kind of did that right here, especially for this section here. Notice that it's not connected at all with these audio podcasts, just because I feel like I want a little cut off there. So I'll play a little sample and give you an idea of why I added the effects in to kind of disguise it. So let's take a listen to what we're doing here, what's in the audio clip here.
A heated debate about this topic, but it way and not so over glorified, I guess.
Yeah, so in this case, you can hear it's kind of cut off. If I left it the way it was, it'll sound kind of weird. So instead, I added some sort of sound effects, so it kind of helps take away the tension a little bit here.
So I was a little disappointed because I always have a heated debate about this topic, but it's way and not so over glorified.
So in a way, people don't have to hear a really weird abrupt cut, and there's like something to fill out the gap, so it doesn't seem off-putting to the listener. So I always make sure that when I'm editing, that's what I'm looking for. These really weird break cuts that sometimes you may have. Find something to either find ways to make it sound less noticeable and more concealed. So in this case, I use sound effects to disguise the break instead of just leaving it raw without having anything. You want to make sure things flow nicely. But sometimes you don't have it perfect, and this is kind of a good scenario to show you that not all the time the audio will cut off nicely. So this is kind of a good way to be aware of these things and try to inject some sort of effects. Maybe try to fade something out. In this case, just go to here, tail end. This is what we call fade, kind of fading out. So that's what you can do to kind of smooth out the audio experience, right? Just think of it like driving a car. You want it to be on a smooth road versus like a lot of bumps on the road. All right, so that's one of the most key important things about kind of the second phase of the detailing phase. Pay attention to your cuts. Make sure that you inject something or make it seem smooth and transition nicely.